So for this episode, I'm going to cover what I believe to be the two fastest combat purpose buoys in the production line that I've ever had the privilege of moving with, but also owning. And this is outside of my custom Bagwells, which in my opinion I consider superior in terms of learning and practicing with the Bowie knife combative system. And what I'm going to be talking about today is the magnificent Ontario Belle and the incomparable Cold Steel Laredo. Let's start first with the Cold Steel Laredo. Some of you who've been following this channel know that I've already done a previous Cold Steel Laredo buoy, and I've sung its praises in terms of its speed, in terms of its power, in terms of just how educative it is. And as I've mentioned in many videos before, when I was on the phone with Bill Bagwell, he had just received the Cold Steel Laredo from Lynn Thompson himself, where Lynn was soliciting some feedback. If you're going to be making a fighting buoy, you are in really good hands soliciting the feedback of the master himself, Bill Bagwell. And there are many things I really love about this, because not only is it really super fast, this knife really loves to move. So once I start to create that momentum, this knife likes to create that momentum as well. It really follows it. But most of all, it's such so that if I start to create, let's say, a backcut movement here, and I'm done with that movement, notice that it will just make the adjustment so that now I can go into the next movement. And the reason why this is important is because a buoy backcut flow is just that. It's a flow. In French, it's called an enchaînement, meaning you're putting a chain of movements together. But this becomes very difficult if you have a knife that was not designed with a combat purpose, or it was not designed with a martial artist background. And Lynn Thompson and Bill Bagwell are both martial artists, so they knew the value of designing a knife that likes to move and is able to chain a lot of movements together. So it's kind of like an enchaînement buoy backcut flow, and I really love this about the Cold Steel Laredo. Not far behind it, in fact I don't think it's behind it at all, you also have the Ontario Belle. And my gosh, when this thing puts combinations together, it allows it so that, and coming from a practitioner who spent a lot of reps with these two knives, there's something about the lightness of this Bowie knife, so that although it has these enchaînement capabilities, the ability to chain combinations together, it allows it so that some of those circular movements can become a little smaller, which is a kind of cool thing, because if I move it from the wrist, which is allowed in Bowie knife combatives, if I move from the wrist, I don't get a ding. I don't feel anything in my wrist. I don't feel any hot spots in the hand. If I try to do that with the Cold Steel Laredo, it can do it also, but there's just some sort of sweet feeling that happens when I do it with the Ontario Belle. There's just this super zing that comes with it. The other movement capability that we're going to want to take a look at is obviously the snap cut. And boy, oh boy, this guy likes the snap cut so much, because notice that both of them, they both like the snap cut, and they both have this wonderful coffin handle. And the coffin handle has been around for a very long time. You'll see it on a lot of antique buoys, but Bill kind of made it his thing so that this became his signature, the coffin handle. But I do want you to make note of a couple of differences with the coffin handle between the Cold Steel Laredo and the Ontario Belle. Notice the squarishness, the kind of boxy, unilateral boxy look of the Cold Steel Laredo. Not a bad thing. In fact, it's one heck of a snap cutter, because it's tapered at the top, so that there's a lot of space here, so that when I open that up, look at all that space it gives me, so that when I pull the trigger and it really transfers forward. But a lot of that is because it gives me the space, and then when I pull, there's not a lot of space behind the handle and then the palm. So there's a lot of space here, but it closes it really fast, boom, and then it really transfers very well. One thing I want you to notice about the Ontario Belle, and it's such a wonderful detail to it, is that if you notice, there's a little bit of a curve on that Ontario Belle. Do you see how it likes to curve to the left? So there's a very, very slight pistol grip to it, which is very similar to the custom Bagwell that I have, which has a far more pronounced pistol grip action. So the one thing I really like about that kind of knife, there's two things about it. Interestingly, when you start to see that kind of handle ergonomic going on, that curving of the handle, which is a little bit like a pistol grip, allows it to be one heck of a snap cutter also. But because of that ergonomic design, as I pull in here, right here, when I pull in with my fingers, it allows it so that, because there's a little more space up here because it's not as boxy, it allows it so that I can pull in maybe a touch more. And notice how, I want you to see this, notice how when I start to pull, notice how the knife starts to angle in, it starts to angle in. It's a little different with the Cold Steel Laredo because there's not as much space here. When I pull in, it stays straight. I hope you can see that. So when I'm here and I pull in, I snap cut, I pull in and snap cut, it stays relatively straight. But if you notice with the Ontario Belle, when I start to pull, it angles. When I pull, it angles because there's extra space. And you know where I'm gonna go with this. It allows for the wonderful combination that I love training with all of my Belle, which is snap cut, back cut, snap cut, back cut. Doesn't mean I can't do it with the Cold Steel Laredo. I can do it also, and that feels really good. But to me, it feels far more natural because I get that natural feedback from the Ontario Belle simply because once I pull it angles, once I pull it angles, once I pull it angles. Snap cut, you see how it snap cuts and it comes right back for that back cut. So when I go ahead and snap cut, notice when I snap cut, you see how it comes back this way? You see how snap cut, when I squeeze it, angles just a little bit, just a little bit. Not so with the Cold Steel Laredo. You see how my wrist is neutral? And it's coming straight forward on the snap cut. My wrist is neutral. You see how it angles? See how it angles? So after the snap cut, it's like it comes snap cut, then it comes back, snap cut, then angles off. And that's perfect for the snap cut, back cut flow, snap cut, back cut flow. That's one of the important features of the Ontario Belle. Because of Bill Bagwell's feedback, he was able to give just the slightest detail to it to make a difference. This is an important side bit of history. Handle ergonomics is so important, especially in the warrior class, that in the creation of the Japanese katana, there is a separate artisan who actually designs the tsukamaki of the Japanese katana so that it is ergonomically designed. And it's called wasting, like it creates a waist on it. When you go ahead and handle some production or replica Japanese swords, they have this kind of axe handle to it. If you happen to handle a really good production Japanese sword like a Bugei or a Huawei, you start to feel some of that tapering. But if you ever get to see, or if you're really lucky, handle a true Japanese sword up close, you can see the wasting and how ornate it is, in that it looks a little bit like the coffin handle. So it flares out here, it comes in this way, but then it flares right back out again so that you can two-hand it really comfortably, so that when you deliver any of those cutting movements with the Japanese sword, you can squeeze that handle really tight. It flares out at the top, flares out at the bottom, so that it really aligns your entire body. But that's how important handle ergonomics is when it comes to the kind of handling that a warrior demands as it relates to their combatives practice. And a Bowie knife combatives is very demanding because a lot of these movements are not necessarily natural. It requires a lot of fine motor skill to be able to chain them together. So this one, from a snap cut, back cut flow, holy smokes, this is an absolute dream to work with. You can still do it with the Cold Steel Laredo. Nothing holds you back from being able to do it at all. But there's a little bit more pleasure, a little bit more fine tuning with the Ontario Belle when it comes to that movement. When it comes to the thrust, when it comes to the inquartada technique, this one, I really enjoy moving it with this one. However, there's a bit of a drawback from the perspective of my practice. it's a little excessive on the handle here, and what happens is, so that when I thrust, the issue is that it doesn't align. Notice how when I thrust, there's a bit of an angle here, so that the tip doesn't align with my radial bone, so that when I thrust with it, it doesn't have that bone alignment. If you, in your training, happen to be thrusting a relatively hard target and you thrust with it, you're not going to have that skeletal alignment supporting it, because you can see here what's really stopping it is this handle. I'm going to need to move it forward this way, but just by looking at it, you know this isn't a very secure grip. This is very different with the Cold Steel Laredo. With the Cold Steel Laredo, when I start to align it this way, it immediately aligns simply because there's less handle to have to deal with. So when I drop it in this orientation, that tip lines up with the ulnar bone really nice. But it's because there's less handle to deal with. And it's the same exact thing when I go into the edge up orientation. So in edge up, this is something that also wins because of that bone alignment with the tip. This is where the Ontario House Bell doesn't necessarily win out, because even in the edge up orientation, remember the angling here, it actually works against it. It actually makes it even a more severe angle, as you can see. This is my wrist being neutral, and if I do it in the edge up orientation, even if I go into some sort of radial ulnar deviation, it does line up, but look at the position my wrist is in. I could wrist lock myself here, so it's not really optimal. Interestingly, when I was talking to Bill about the dog bone design for the 2 custom Bagwells that he was working on, we did talk about using them in an edge up manner. He wanted them to deploy edge up, which I think was very interesting, but it just goes to show you just how he was constantly thinking about linking design with use. So going back to this, in my opinion, I think what he wanted this Ontario House Bell to be was your dedicated Curriculum A, Bowie backcut, snap cut flow, relatively standard and conventional, simply because that's the most effective and it's the easiest to do. If you go edge up, that's a whole other ball game. If you do any sort of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's like the difference between a very basic close guard versus spider guard, De La Riva, X guard variations, which are very effective, but boy, you better know your basics before you move on to something like that. Last one, and I think it's a virtual tie between these two. I think the Reverso is really super fast for both of them. Even from this conventional position, a Reverso this way is really super fast, and I'm not feeling anything different when I do it from the Cold Steel Laredo. There just isn't any difference there. So this is a virtual tie from the Reverso, and I think that's really good because the Reverso is one of those severely underrated techniques in the Bowie Combatives curriculum, only because it's not flashy. It's one of those techniques that if you do it very quickly, technically it's one of those combative movements that you cannot see. You're literally sparring with somebody and then you're making a move, bam, and then they do one of these and you don't know what you got hit with. So the good thing is that with the Ontario House Bell and the Cold Steel Laredo, they are a virtual tie. And I know I'm going to be asked, which one do you prefer? Which one do you edge out? Honestly, in my opinion, it's a virtual tie between both of them. I think that if you're going to classify them in any way, if you want your Bowie knife practice to be primarily in the conventional Bowie combative curriculum, meaning you're going to be focusing primarily on the snap cut in cortada back cut flow, which is what it's known for, go with the Ontario House Bell. If you want to spend a little bit more time on that edge up orientation, this might be the knife for you because it's a slightly shorter handle, but also it helps the tip aligns with the radial bone far better because of the shorter handle. So I'm going to be moving with it so that you can judge for yourself what works best for you, but in my opinion, get both, because if you're really serious about your Bowie knife combatives practice, you got to have these two in your collection. As always, when you're practicing with any edge weapons that are really sharp, specifically the Ontario House Bell and the Cold Steel Laredo, make sure that you are working with a qualified professional to ensure that it is always your safety first. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for letting me share. The Cold Steel Laredo Bowie is quite possibly the fastest and most powerful production Bowie available today. The Ontario House Bell, although out of production, is equally as fast and as powerful. Upon a cursory comparison, what may seem like minor design differences have major implications in terms of movement efficiency and application. Due to its shortened coffin handle, the Cold Steel Laredo excels in both the edge-down orientation of the Bowie knife as well as its edge-up orientation. It moves very well in both, but at the same time, it also transitions very easily, going from edge down to edge up, making it the optimal Bowie knife to explore both the edge down and edge up curriculums. Transitioning now to the Ontario Bill Bagwell Hell's Bell, I am of the belief that Bill had designed this with Ontario with the more basic to intermediate backcut curriculum. If we're looking at the edge up orientation, as you can see, there are some severe limitations to it, specifically because of that lengthened handle. Also, with that very narrow devil's horn handle, it doesn't make it a very comfortable fit when we're doing it in the edge up orientation. Transitioning now to the Cold Steel Laredo with some Bowie backcuts, you can see how quickly and how smoothly it moves, and a lot of that has to do with that shortened coffin handle pressing into the mechanoreceptors of my palm, allowing the shoulder girdle and the myofascial complex relating to the oblique sling along the waist, making it a very core-centric movement. Very powerful and very efficient, and I really like moving with the Cold Steel Laredo with the Bowie backcut flow. Transitioning now to the Ontario Bagwell Hell's Bell, because of its design relating to the handle and that narrower blade profile, it moves faster because of that slightly pistol grip design in the handle and its narrower blade profile. I can utilize some of my wrist, combining it with my shoulder girdle for faster movements. Transitioning now to the Cold Steel Laredo, you'll see some slight and relatively negligible slowdown. A lot of that is because I cannot use my wrist as part of the movement, and it is coming primarily from my core. Now let's take a look at snap cuts as a comparison. Wow, that was actually pretty good. Again, because of its shortened coffin handle, it has a way of traveling a much longer distance along my palm so that it generates far more speed and momentum when I use the snap cut. It is far straighter also because it lacks that pistol grip dimension that the Ontario Hell's Bells has. Now, I'm not saying that the Ontario Hell's Bell is some sort of slouch. It is also extremely fast. But remember, because of its pistol grip design, it's going to have some limitations in terms of range of motion with the snap cut. Going back to the Cold Steel Laredo, now let's take a look at the thrust. And again, because of that shortened coffin handle, it can travel along my palm further from that palm cushion I mentioned all the way to the bottom of my thumb and right in front of the radius bone. And now it creates that bone alignment for that thrust so that my entire anatomy is pushing along that tip and into the target when I execute the thrust. This is what makes the Cold Steel Laredo exceptional, especially when I'm using a backcut thrust combination. Going now to the Ontario Hell's Bell, that lengthened coffin's handle actually gets in the way of aligning with the radius bone. So although it can still thrust, it is not aligned with the radius bone. So to a certain extent, some of the force that you generate is dissipated without the support of the anatomy, versus the Cold Steel Laredo, where it actually moves up into this position and now perfectly aligns the tip with the radius bone. This is the optimal position that you are looking for when you're thrusting with the Bowie. Now my entire anatomy can get right behind it every time I throw it into a specific target. We can make an adjustment with the Ontario Hell's Bell. It's going to require that you open your fingers just a little bit so it will align. So it requires a lot of practice on your part and have that specific tactile feel to get it aligned for that thrust. It requires some loosening of the fingers to get it to align, because it will align if you do that, but it takes a lot of practice and a lot of care in order for it to get into that position into your palm. So really approach this with a lot of caution. The optimal combination for the Ontario Hell's Bell is going to be the back cut and snap cut. So we're going to be using that primarily for the Ontario Hellsbell, the backcut and snap cut. If we go to the Cold Steel Laredo, you're going to be using some back cuts, but the majority of your techniques as far as combinations are concerned is going to be the thrust, the incortada thrust, and then the snap cut. So it's going to be snap cut and thrust, snap cut and thrust with the occasional back cut. Because of this shortened handle, it aligns far better with snap cut and thrust combinations. It really is good at occupying center line with those techniques, and it just happens to be one of my favorite combinations in sparring. Moving on to the Ontario Hellsbell, its optimal combination is going to be a snap cut and back cut, and I have to tell you that in sparring, this is one of those combinations that will easily catch me because of how the snap cut just comes down the center line, making the blade completely invisible, and as I try to retreat out of the way, I'm completely not in a position and I get hit with a back cut. This is one of the most effective combinations I've ever seen, and this is why I understand how Bill Bagwell optimized Ontario Hellsbell specifically for this flow, the snap cut and back cut flow. I can't emphasize enough that if you are serious about your Bowie combatives practice, it is important that you get both, own both, and definitely practice with both to appreciate their nuances. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Stick around, stay tuned, more videos to come.